The scorching midday heat made the air shimmer in the garden of my house. There stood Ethan, the gardener, sweaty and focused on his work. The sun reflected off his muscles, outlining every curve as he deftly handled the tools. I was on the balcony, watching him through the curtains, feeling a nagging curiosity that I couldn't contain. Our gazes met for a brief moment when he raised his head, perhaps to rest his eyes from the intense sun. I felt a wave of heat rise through my body. But it wasn't just the effect of the sun. There was something in that look, an instant chemistry that left me breathless. Even though I was married to Michael, I couldn't look away. "Hi, Ethan. Do you need anything?" I asked, trying to sound casual while my legs trembled slightly. "I'm fine. Thank you, ma'am. Just enjoying the day," he replied with a smile, his eyes twinkling in a way that made my heart race. The tension between us was palpable. Every time he moved between the plants, I felt a strange tingling, as if something was about to happen. And then the question that wouldn't go away popped into my head. How did we get to this point? Me, a married woman, feeling this way about another man. "I think the heat is getting to me," I muttered to myself, trying to push those forbidden thoughts away, but they persisted. Ethan approached me once more, this time to pick up a hose that was lying next to me. Our fingers touched for a brief second, and the electricity of that contact made my body shudder. "I'm sorry," he said, pulling back slightly, but the smile on his face showed that he felt something too. "It was nothing," I replied, trying to control my breathing. As he went back to work, I couldn't get the intensity of that moment out of my head. Could it be that he was attracted too? And what was I supposed to do now? The fine line between temptation and betrayal became harder and harder to ignore, and the tension between us only grew. And then, there, in the garden of my house, under the scorching midday heat, I realized that I was about to enter dangerous territory, where the consequences could be devastating. But at that moment, all I could think about was what it would be like to give in to that temptation. The day Ethan started working for us in Los Angeles was one of those life-changing days. Michael and I were sitting in the living room when we heard the doorbell. Michael got up to answer it, and soon after, entered the room with Ethan by his side. "Laura, this is Ethan, the new gardener," said Michael with a smile on his face. I put out my hand to greet him, and the moment our gazes met, I felt something different. The handshake lasted only a second longer than necessary, but it was enough to create a silent connection between us. He had strong, calloused hands, the kind of hands that are earned through hard work. "Nice to meet you, Mrs. Laura," he said with a smile that made my heart soar. "Please, just call me Laura," I replied, trying not to show the excitement I felt inside. That first meeting was quick, but it left its mark. Over the next few days, whenever I saw him working in the garden, I couldn't help but smile. There was something about Ethan that attracted me in an inexplicable way. Perhaps it was the way he moved, with a quiet confidence, or maybe it was the intense sparkle in his eyes when he looked at me. One afternoon, while I was watering the plants, he approached me. "Can I help you?" he asked, taking the hose from my hands. Our fingers brushed for a moment, and I felt a tingle run through my body. "Sure, thanks," I replied, trying to keep my composure. We started chatting about trivial things, but the tension in the air was palpable. Every word exchanged seemed to carry a deeper meaning. "Do you like plants?" he asked, looking at the flowers around us. "Yes, I like looking after them. It's a way to escape from routine," I replied, my eyes meeting his for a brief moment before I looked away. "I see. I think we all need an escape from time to time," he said, his voice low, almost a whisper. The conversation was interrupted by Michael calling my name from the kitchen. Ethan handed the hose back to me, and our fingers touched again, sending a rush of electricity through my body. "See you, Laura," he said, with a smile that made my heart race once again. "See you, Ethan," I replied, trying to ignore the turmoil of emotions inside me. That night, as I lay next to Michael, I couldn't stop thinking about Ethan. His smile, his touch, the tingling sensation he caused in me. It was something I hadn't felt for a long time, something I didn't know I could still feel. From that moment on, I knew that my life would never be the same. The sun was shining that afternoon when I decided to water the plants in the garden. Michael had gone to work, and I needed a moment alone to distract myself. I picked up the hose and began to water the flowers, observing every detail of the petals. Then I heard footsteps behind me. "Hi, do you need any help?" Ethan's voice made me turn quickly. There he was, with that calm expression and a smile that was starting to become familiar. "Oh, Ethan, you don't need it," I replied, trying to keep my composure. "But thank you." He moved closer, ignoring my protest. "Let me help you. 2 hands are better than 1. He took the hose from my hand, our fingers touching for a brief second. I felt a shiver run up my spine. As we watered together, we started chatting about trivial things. The weather, the work in the garden. But soon the conversation took another turn. "You seem to really like these plants," he commented, looking at me with a twinkle in his eye. "Yes, they bring me peace," I replied, realizing that I was revealing more than I had intended. "Sometimes it's good to have a space to escape to." "I understand," he said, his voice low and soft. "Everyone needs a place to escape from time to time." The closeness between us was palpable. I could feel the warmth of his body next to me. The subtle touch of his hand as he adjusted the hose made my heart soar. It wasn't just the physical sensation, but the unexpected connection that was beginning to form. "Ethan, have you always been a gardener?" I asked, trying to keep the conversation light but curious to know more about him. "Not really," he replied, with an enigmatic smile. "I did something else before, but I found my passion here in the garden. And what about you? Have you always liked plants?" I laughed, shaking my head. "Not exactly. It was something I discovered after I married Michael. He's very busy, you know? So, the garden became my refuge." The tension between us grew with every word. His touch, however subtle, seemed to carry an electricity that made me dizzy. When our gazes met, it was as if time stood still. "I think the garden is a special place," he said, holding my gaze, "especially when you have someone to share it with." I couldn't reply. His words resonated in my mind, echoing desires that I tried to ignore. He moved closer, his face just a few centimeters from mine. I could feel his breathing, warm and rhythmic. "Ethan," I began, but he interrupted. "Shh. You don't have to say anything. I know." He leaned in, and for a moment, I thought he was going to kiss me. But instead, he just rested his forehead against mine, closing his eyes. That simple gesture was more intimate than any words or touch. Our moment was interrupted by the sound of a car passing in the street. We moved away quickly, as if we had been caught doing something wrong. But the truth was that at that moment, I couldn't think of anything else but how I wanted that chance encounter to happen again. "I need to get back to work," he said, taking a step back, but without taking his eyes off me. "If you need any help with anything, I'm here." "Thanks, Ethan," I replied, trying to hide the mixture of emotions that flooded me. "I'll remember that." As he walked away, I continued to water the plants, but my mind was far from there. I was going over every detail of the encounter, every word, every touch. The chemistry between us was undeniable, and I knew I was playing with fire. But I couldn't help it. Something about Ethan attracted me in a way I'd never experienced before. I went back into the house, trying to concentrate on something else, but the sensation of Ethan's touch was still on my skin. I knew that this had only been the first of many casual encounters in the garden, and I wondered how far this would take us. The text messages between Ethan and me began innocently enough. Questions about the garden, plant care tips, but soon they became something more. Each day, the messages became bolder, more personal. I found myself smiling as I read his words, feeling a warmth on my face and a growing guilt in my chest. How could I be doing this to Michael? One afternoon, while Michael was at work, my cell phone vibrated. It was a message from Ethan. "You look beautiful today, you know that?" My heart raced. I knew I shouldn't reply, but my fingers seemed to have a mind of their own. "Thank you. You look good today, too." The answer came almost instantly. "Fine. I'm sweaty and covered in dirt. But thank you. It's nice to know you notice me." I laughed softly, looking around to make sure no one was around. Guilt was always there, a shadow that followed me around. But the excitement of talking to Ethan was undeniable. Later that evening, while we were having dinner, Michael noticed that I was distracted. "Is everything all right, love?" he asked, with a worried look on his face. I nodded quickly, forcing a smile. "Yeah, I'm just tired." Michael didn't look convinced, but he didn't insist. I felt terrible for lying to him, but at the same time I couldn't stop thinking about Ethan. The next day, while I was in the kitchen, I received another message from Ethan. "I need help in the garden. Can you come?" I knew I didn't need any help, but the idea of being near him was tempting. I grabbed a hat and went out into the garden, trying to look as casual as possible. "Ethan, where are you?" I called out, looking around. He emerged from behind a tree, smiling. "Over here. I needed some help with that." He was holding a hose, but didn't really look like he needed help. I approached, sensing the tension in the air. "What do you need me to do?" He smiled, that smile that made my heart soar. "I just wanted to see you." My face flushed, and I looked at the floor. "Ethan, this isn't right." He took a step forward, reducing the distance between us. "I know, but I can't help it." I couldn't help it either. And that's when the first lie came out. "Michael's going to be late today. Maybe I can help later." Ethan raised an eyebrow, surprised by my answer. "I'll be waiting." I went back into the house, my heart beating like a drum. What was I doing? But at the same time, I couldn't stop thinking about Ethan. Guilt and excitement mixed together, creating a whirlwind of emotions inside me. I spent the rest of the day trying to concentrate on other things, but my thoughts always returned to the garden, to Ethan. When night finally came and Michael went to bed, I told myself that I would only go there to talk, to clear things up. But deep down, I knew I was fooling myself. I sneaked out, making sure Michael was fast asleep. When I got to the garden, Ethan was already there, waiting. "Ethan, we can't go through with this," I whispered, trying to keep my voice steady. He came closer, his eyes fixed on mine. "I don't want to stop, and neither do you." Before I could reply, he pulled me close, his lips meeting mine in a searing kiss. The guilt and excitement intensified, and I knew it was too late to turn back. The secret meeting in the most secluded corner of the garden was about to take place. The sun had been down for a while, and I could feel the cool evening breeze touching my skin as I walked towards our meeting point. My heart was beating fast, and every step seemed to echo in my mind. I wondered how it had come to this, but the sexual tension between Ethan and me was almost unbearable. I arrived at the agreed place, and there he was, waiting for me with that irresistible smile. "I thought you weren't coming," he said, his voice low and husky. I couldn't hold back a nervous smile. "I almost didn't come," I replied, trying to ignore the guilt that was eating me up inside. "You're amazing," he whispered in my ear, his hands exploring every inch of my body. I felt a shiver run down my spine, and I couldn't help but moan softly. "Ethan," I whispered, trying to find words to explain the whirlwind of emotions I was feeling, but all I could do was pull him closer. That first night of intense passion amidst the plants was a mixture of madness and ecstasy. Every movement, every touch, seemed to imprint itself on my memory. We gave ourselves to each other in a way I had never experienced before. The connection between us was palpable, almost tangible, and I didn't want it to end. When it was over, we lay there, panting, our bodies intertwined. Reality began to seep back in, bringing with it a wave of guilt and regret. "We need to be careful," I said, my voice shaking. "Michael can't find out." Ethan nodded, kissing my forehead softly. "I know. But I can't stay away from you," he confessed, his eyes shining with a mixture of desire and determination. I knew I was playing with fire, but the attraction between us was too strong to ignore. "Promise me we'll be discreet," I asked, trying to control the fear that was beginning to grow inside me. He held my face between his hands and looked deep into my eyes. "I promise. I'll do everything I can to make sure no one finds out," he assured me. As we stood up and straightened our clothes, the reality of what we had done began to set in. The remorse mixed with the excitement of last night hit me hard. The plants around us, silent witnesses to our encounter, seemed to whisper secrets to the wind. We walked back to the house in silence, each lost in our own thoughts. When I came in, Michael was in the living room, watching TV, oblivious to what was happening in the garden. "Hi, love," he greeted me, without taking his eyes off the screen. "How was it out there?" "It was good," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. "I just needed some fresh air." He smiled, satisfied with the answer, and went back to concentrating on the program. I climbed the stairs to our room, my mind still spinning with the night's events. I knew that this was only the beginning of something very complicated and dangerous, but the attraction between Ethan and me was too strong to ignore. The first kiss had been a turning point, and now there was no turning back. I woke up that morning with a mixture of regret and excitement. The night before was still vivid in my mind. Every touch, every sigh, every sensation. I felt alive in a way I hadn't for years, but along with this euphoria came guilt. Michael was in the kitchen, preparing breakfast as he did every day. I watched him from afar, trying to keep my composure. "Good morning," he said, smiling at me as he stirred his coffee. "Did you sleep well?" "Yes, I did," I replied, forcing a smile. "And you?" "Like a rock," he laughed, not realizing the internal battle I was fighting. I moved closer and gave him a quick kiss on the cheek, trying to ignore the guilt that was consuming me. During breakfast, my mind constantly wandered to Ethan. I thought about the fantasies that were beginning to take over my innermost thoughts. The way he looked at me, the way he touched me, it was as if he could see every desire hidden inside me. It was disturbing and exciting at the same time. After coffee, I went out into the garden, where Ethan was already working. My heart raced at the sight of him. He had his back to me, but seemed to sense my presence. When he turned and our eyes met, there was an instant spark. He smiled, that smile that said so much more than words could ever say. "Good morning," he said, his voice low and full of intent. "Good morning," I replied, trying to stay calm. "How's work going?" "Well, I've almost finished here," he said, approaching me slowly. "Did you sleep well?" "Yes, I did," I replied, my heart racing. The tension between us was palpable, almost unbearable. "I couldn't stop thinking about you," he admitted, his voice low, almost a whisper. "Me neither," I confessed, my voice trembling. "But we have to be careful." "I know," he said, touching my arm gently. "But it's worth it, isn't it?" At that moment, his touch seemed to electrify my body. It was as if every cell was alive, vibrating with his closeness. I knew I was playing with fire, but the thrill, the risk, was addictive. Michael passed through the garden on his way to the car, and I had to pull myself together quickly. Ethan also walked away, going back to work as if nothing had happened. I watched Michael leave, feeling a twinge of guilt, but at the same time, a growing excitement. The danger of being discovered only increased the desire. I spent the rest of the day trying to act normally, but thoughts of Ethan were constant. Every time I was alone, my mind went back to the night before, to what we had done, to what we still wanted to do. It was a dangerous game, but I was willing to take the risk. In the afternoon, when Michael still hadn't returned, I went back to the garden. Ethan was there, waiting for me. The tension between us was stronger than ever. He moved closer, and I couldn't resist. Our lips met in an urgent kiss, full of passion and desire. "We need to be careful," he repeated. But I knew he was as involved as I was. "I know," I replied, gasping for breath. "But I can't stop." "Neither can I," he said, his eyes fixed on mine. "This is dangerous, but I don't want you to stop." That night, lying next to Michael, my mind went back to the moments with Ethan. The fantasies became bolder, the desire more intense. I was trapped in a cycle of arousal and guilt, a cycle that, somehow, I didn't want to end. And so began our dangerous dance, a game of passion and risk that could explode at any moment. Every day, with each encounter, the line between desire and betrayal became thinner, and I knew I was playing with fire. But at that moment, the pleasure of taking risks was greater than the fear of the consequences. Ethan's proposal for a date away from home took me by surprise. We were in the garden where it all began, when he approached me with a determined look on his face. "We need to get out of here," he said, as his eyes searched mine. "I want to take you somewhere where we can be together without fear of being discovered." My mind began to spin with the possibilities. The fear of being discovered was real, but the adrenaline rush I felt at the thought of a secret rendezvous far from home was almost irresistible. I nodded in agreement, already feeling the weight of the lie I would have to tell Michael. That night, I made up an excuse about a social engagement with a friend Michael knew, but with whom he didn't keep in touch that much. It was the perfect lie. Michael believed it without question, and I felt a twinge of guilt when I saw him smile and wish me a good night. I drove to the hotel Ethan had chosen, a discreet place far enough away not to arouse suspicion. My heart was pounding as I walked down the corridor towards my room. When I knocked on the door, Ethan opened it almost immediately, and the sight of him there, waiting for me, made my whole body tingle with anticipation. As soon as I entered, he pulled me into an intense kiss, and all the tension that had built up dissolved in that moment. "I've missed you so much," he murmured against my lips, and I could only respond with another kiss. Unbridled passion overtook us. Every touch, every kiss, seemed to set my skin on fire. We were hungry for each other, as if time together was an oasis in the middle of the desert of my everyday life. In the hotel room, far from home, it was as if the outside world ceased to exist, and we were the only two left, surrendered to desire. As we lay in bed, he played with a lock of my hair and looked at me with an intensity that left me breathless. "I want more moments like this with you," he said, his voice full of sincerity. "I don't want it to end." I knew he was right. There was something between us that was impossible to ignore, but the fear of being found out was still there, a shadow that hung over every encounter. "What if someone finds out?" I asked, my voice almost a whisper. "Let's be careful," he replied, holding my face between his hands. "I promise I'll do everything I can to make sure that doesn't happen." Those words gave me a little comfort, but the fear never went away completely. Even so, that night, I decided to give myself over to the moment. Fear and adrenaline mixed together, creating a feeling of euphoria that I had never experienced before. We were living a dangerous dream, but it was a dream I didn't want to wake up from. When we finally said goodbye, I felt a mixture of sadness and excitement. I knew that I would have to go back to my normal life, pretending that nothing had happened. But I also knew that this wouldn't be our last meeting. Ethan and I were connected in a way that was impossible to break. "Until next time," he said, kissing my forehead before I left. "Until next time," I replied, my heart still racing. I drove home, my mind racing. When I got in, Michael was already asleep. I stared at him for a few minutes, feeling the guilt crushing me. But at the same time, a part of me longed for the next meeting with Ethan, the next dose of adrenaline and passion. I lay down next to Michael and closed my eyes, trying to calm my mind. But all I could think about was Ethan and how our story had only just begun. Getting back into a routine after what happened to Ethan was a challenge I hadn't expected to face. Every morning, I woke up next to Michael, my husband, trying to pretend that nothing had changed. But inside me, everything was different. The overwhelming passion I felt for Ethan left me in a constant state of excitement and guilt. "Are you all right, darling?" Michael asked one morning while we were having coffee. His eyes analyzed me with concern. "Yes, I'm fine. Just a bit tired, maybe," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. But I knew he sensed something was wrong. With each passing day, Michael's questions became more frequent and incisive. "You've been going out a lot lately. Anything new on your social agenda?" "Oh, just some book club meetings," I lied, trying to sound casual. But the truth was that every time I went out, it was to meet Ethan, to quench that forbidden desire that I could no longer control. Ethan, for his part, didn't make things any easier. His eyes sparkled with excitement whenever we saw each other, but at the same time, a part of me longed for the next meeting with Ethan, the next dose of adrenaline and passion. I lay down next to Michael and closed my eyes, trying to calm my mind. But all I could think about was Ethan and how our story had only just begun. Getting back into a routine after what happened to Ethan was a challenge I hadn't expected to face. Every morning, I woke up next to Michael, my husband, trying to pretend that nothing had changed. But inside me, everything was different. The overwhelming passion I felt for Ethan left me in a constant state of excitement and guilt. "Are you all right, darling?" Michael asked one morning while we were having coffee. His eyes analyzed me with concern. "Yes, I'm fine. Just a bit tired, maybe," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. But I knew he sensed something was wrong. With each passing day, Michael's questions became more frequent and incisive. "You've been going out a lot lately. Anything new on your social agenda?" "Oh, just some book club meetings," I lied, trying to sound casual. But the truth was that every time I went out, it was to meet Ethan, to quench that forbidden desire that I could no longer control. Ethan, for his part, didn't make things any easier. His eyes sparkled with excitement whenever we saw each other, and he insisted on more meetings. "We need to see each other again," he whispered in my ear, while his hands roaming my body made me tremble with desire. "I don't know if I can," I replied one day, while we were hiding behind one of the trees in the garden. "Michael is starting to get suspicious. This is getting dangerous. I can't stop thinking about you," he said, holding my face with both hands. "I need you, and I know you need me too." Indecision consumed me. On the one hand, there was the security and comfort of my life with Michael, a good and devoted man. On the other, there was the passion and excitement that Ethan gave me, something I had never experienced before. "Be careful, Ethan. We can't be careless," I warned. but my body was already betraying my words, moving closer to his. "We'll find a way," he insisted, his gaze full of determination. "I won't give up on you." His words left me torn. I wanted to believe that we could continue our affair without anyone finding out, but the reality was much more complicated. Every time I returned home after being with Ethan, I felt a lump in my throat and a deep anguish. "You look different," Michael commented one evening while we were having dinner. "I want to know what's going on." "It's nothing, love," I tried to reassure him, but I knew my words sounded empty. The last few weeks had been a whirlwind of emotions. The passion I felt for Ethan contrasted with the guilt that consumed me every time I looked at Michael. I knew I had to make a choice, but the indecision paralyzed me. With each secret meeting with Ethan, I was getting closer to a point of no return, and the thought of losing Michael terrified me. "I can't live like this anymore," I confessed to Ethan during one of our meetings. "I'm destroying my marriage." "I know it's hard," he replied, holding my hands. "But what we feel for each other is real. We can't just ignore it." "What if we're found out?" I asked, my voice trembling. "We'll find a way to deal with it," he said, trying to reassure me. "But for now, we need to be careful." The truth was that I didn't know how to continue living this double life. Every day, the pressure increased, and the line between desire and reality became increasingly blurred. I knew I had to make a decision, but the fear of losing what I had with Ethan was as great as the fear of losing Michael. As I drove home from yet another meeting with Ethan, my thoughts were in turmoil. I needed to find a way to deal with this situation, to resolve this indecision that was consuming me. But every time I tried to think rationally, the memory of Ethan's touch and the passion I felt for him made me question everything. "I love you, Michael," I whispered to myself as I walked into the house. "But I don't know if I can go on living this lie." The return to routine was becoming more and more unbearable, and the need to make a decision was becoming more urgent by the day. I knew I couldn't go on like this for long, but the uncertainty about the future paralyzed me. And so, between the comfort of home and forbidden passion, I continued to live in limbo, not knowing which way to go. I stared at my reflection in the mirror, trying to process the decision I had just made. Continuing the affair with Ethan was something that was eating me up inside, but the passion and adrenaline he brought into my life were irresistible. I took a deep breath and picked up my cell phone. The message to Ethan was short, but loaded with meaning. "Let's keep going." As soon as I finished sending the message, my phone vibrated with his reply. "You won't regret it. Can we meet in the garden tonight?" Ethan's bold proposal made me hesitate for a moment. The garden at night had always been a place of peace for me, a refuge. Now, it would become the stage for a forbidden encounter. I answered with a simple, "Yes." Throughout the day, I tried to keep my composure while Michael was around. He noticed my distraction and asked if everything was all right. "Yes, just a bit tired," I replied, avoiding his eyes. Guilt was eating away at me, but the excitement of meeting Ethan was stronger. When the evening finally arrived, I put on a dress that was light and comfortable, but which I knew would attract Ethan's attention. My heart was racing as I made my way to the garden. The evening breeze blew gently, and the sound of the leaves in the wind was almost soothing. When I reached the garden, I saw Ethan waiting for me. He was half naked, wearing just a pair of jeans, his body glistening in the moonlight. My heart raced even faster. "You came," he said with a smile that mixed desire and satisfaction. "I didn't know if I should," I confessed, taking a hesitant step towards him. "But here I am." Ethan stepped closer, his eyes fixed on mine. "I knew you'd come. I haven't been able to stop thinking about you since day one." He reached out and touched my face gently. "You're all I think about." That touch made my whole body shudder. Ethan, this is so complicated. I know, but we can't ignore what we feel. He leaned in and kissed me. A kiss that started out soft but quickly became more intense. The heat between us was palpable, and every touch seemed to set my skin on fire. We need to be careful, I whispered against his lips, even though every part of me wanted to continue. I know, he replied, his eyes shining with determination. But it's worth it, isn't it? I nodded, knowing that I was giving myself over to something that could destroy everything I knew, but at the same time, it made me feel more alive than ever. Yes, it is. We spent the evening in the garden. We talked, we laughed, we kissed. Every moment with Ethan was a mixture of excitement and fear, but I couldn't stop. When we finally said goodbye, the promise of more dates was clear in the air. I returned home to bed next to Michael, my mind in turmoil. The guilt was still there, but now there was something else. There was the certainty that, despite everything, I couldn't resist Ethan. And so the decision to continue our affair was firmly made. I was nervous that night. The wind blew gently through the garden, carrying with it the scent of flowers and the distant sound of traffic. Darkness enveloped everything around me, creating an atmosphere of mystery and anticipation. I knew I was about to cross a line from which there would be no return, but I couldn't help the excitement growing inside me. I went downstairs carefully, trying not to make a sound, and crossed the living room. Michael was asleep in his room, oblivious to the whirlwind of emotions that was consuming me. As I opened the back door, I felt a shiver run down my spine. The garden looked different at night, more intimate and full of secrets. When I arrived at the agreed location, I saw Ethan waiting for me. He was leaning against a tree, half naked, wearing only dark jeans. The moonlight illuminated his body, highlighting every muscle. I felt my heart race at the sight of him like this, so vulnerable and yet so irresistible. "Ethan," I whispered, trying to keep my voice steady. "Are you crazy?" He smiled, a smile full of mischief and desire. "Crazy about you, maybe." I approached him slowly, feeling every step as if I were in a dream. When I finally reached him, I felt the warmth of his skin against mine. "What if someone catches us here?" I asked, my voice shaking with nervousness and excitement. "They won't," he replied, pulling me closer. "Trust me." Before I could reply, I heard a sound, a branch breaking. My body immediately froze, and I looked around, trying to identify the source of the noise. "What was that?" I asked, my heart beating even faster. "Probably an animal," Ethan said, but there was tension in his voice. He was worried too. We were silent for a moment, listening only to our own breathing. The sense of danger only added to the excitement. "We're alone," Ethan finally said, his voice lower, almost a whisper. "But we're vulnerable." I knew he was right. At any moment, someone could come along and catch us. But that possibility, instead of scaring me, made me want it even more. "So what are we going to do?" I asked, defying the fear I felt. Ethan didn't answer with words. Instead, he pulled me into a deep, passionate kiss. I felt his hands sliding down my body, each touch sending waves of pleasure through me. I was lost in him, in his touch, in his smell, in his presence. "We shouldn't be doing this," I murmured against his lips, but my resistance was fading fast. "But we are," he replied, his voice laden with desire. "And you want it as much as I do." He was right. I wanted it more than anything, and at that moment, nothing else mattered. Guilt, fear, everything was swept away by the intensity of what we felt. Ethan leaned over and whispered in my ear, "Trust me, we'll be fine." I wanted to believe him, and for a moment, I let myself be carried away by the illusion that everything would be all right. I gave myself up completely, forgetting the world around us. The feeling of being alive, really alive, was intoxicating. When we finally pulled away, panting and satisfied, I looked at him and saw the same glint of excitement and fear in his eyes. That was incredible, I said, trying to catch my breath. And it's going to get even better, he promised, stroking my cheek tenderly. At that moment, everything seemed possible. But at the same time, I knew we were playing with fire. Every encounter, every kiss, every touch was a risk, a bet against luck. And although the excitement was intoxicating, reality would soon come knocking again. "We need to be careful," I said, finally finding my voice. "I know," he replied, but there was a glint of defiance in his eyes. "But it's worth it, isn't it?" I couldn't answer. Instead, I just nodded, knowing that whatever happened, I wouldn't be able to stop. Ethan had become my addiction, my escape, and I was willing to risk everything for him. As we walked slowly back to the house, still feeling the electricity of the encounter, the question persisted in my mind. How long could we keep this a secret? And more importantly, were we prepared to face the consequences when the truth finally came out? But that night, at least for a few hours, I chose to live in the present, savoring every moment, every sensation, every touch. Because deep down, I knew that moments like that were rare, precious, and above all, fleeting.